Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, and I have to say, before I introduce you and introduce our guest, is that about 10 years ago, when I was writing my thesis, I came to Washington D.C. for a trip, and I said I'll put in some stuff from America. I wrote a thesis about libertarianism, and I wanted to contrast it with what was happening in the U.S. And I sent an email to our guest, and he graciously we met for lunch, and part of what he told me was in my thesis to this day. So it's a full circle, as we say. So now I'll introduce you. Ilya Shapiro is the director of um, the constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute, and I know you from when you were in Cato. So you have extensive stuff in all these fields, especially in constitutional law. And I know you were in Israel lately, so it's great to talk to you about everything that's going on, and we'll get into the stuff. But first, I'm happy to have you here.
Yeah, good to be with you. I had forgotten the bit about your thesis, so now I can take credit for all of your professional success. That's
Exactly.
that's good to know. And just to clarify for your listeners, the Manhattan Institute is indeed based in Manhattan, in New York, but I live in Falls Church, Virginia, in the outskirts of Washington, and work from home and raising my family of four little kids here, and it's a wonderful life.
Yeah, and I met you when you actually did work in Washington, so at the time. So let's start with just not exactly law, but maybe it has to do a lot with law and order, as we say. We're looking from Israel at what's happening in America and in the West in general, but more specifically where you are. We see, I guess, over the past month and a half, but even all the way from October 7, just huge protests. And I think maybe since the last month or so, they've even gotten more violent, more anti-Semitic in the open. The more famous one was in Columbia, but we've had them in Harvard and USC, in Los Angeles, and basically every single university and college in America had these things. And the videos coming out are like either totally anti-Semitic or stupid students. I think that's
And it's
the
it's
general.
just bizarre. And
Yeah, exactly.
this was a concerted campaign organized by the National Students for Justice in Palestine. There are all these toolkits and organization plans and all that. But I'll tell you what, Ariel, it does look bad, and it
Yeah,
says unhealthy things about our society. I mean, why is it that the heart of anti-Semitism in America is in its most educated, so-called progressive bastions, right?
yeah,
But it gets the news, but it's not reflective of American
I
popular
know.
opinion. I mean, the survey results seem to be pretty consistent. Yeah, people would rather there not be a war, but then you ask, well, what if the hostages are still there and Hamas is still there? Should we still have ceasefire? And the answer is 80% no. So
Yeah,
these students, there are the radicals and those who are actively support the terrorists. There are the clueless types and the fellow travelers and what have you. But regardless, it does indicate problems with both university and broader governance that we can get into. But I just want to make clear it's crazy and it's bizarre, but it's not representative of America as a whole.
yes. And just on that point, we do have especially I think the Harvard Harris poll comes out every so often, and we see the just overwhelming support of the American public for Israel and for the stated goals of the war, which is bringing the hostages back and destroying Hamas. We see that. Although I would say that 18 to 23-year-olds are a lot less supportive of Israel. So you do have, I think it is a worrying trend. I interviewed Alan Dershowitz not too long ago, and he was much more depressed than you are about that. And he said that he felt that there could come a time in the next 20, 30 years when these kids will be the next generation of leaders in America. And we could have a very big problem. But I do take your point that it is a very small minority among the general public. But
Well,
one,
that's why we need to fix our education system. And
yes,
my next book, it's just been pushed. It's tough to put out a book during a presidential election year, and so
yeah,
even though I sort of have already wrote it, submitted it, it's been edited, but it's coming out in January. It's called "Lawless: The Miseducation of America's Elites," and it focuses on legal education because lawyers are the gatekeepers of our
right,
political and legal institutions, and we've had a lot of Thankfully, not so much with respect to the post-October 7th demonstrations and things, but there have been a lot of problems with law schools specifically the last few years.
Yeah, we'll get into that specifically also about what you went through, which I just find I think it does show um, what is going on right now. In a lot of respects, it foreshadowed maybe what we're seeing. But I do, before that, want to say that it seems to me that a lot of what's happening, and it is a minority, is that because maybe social media, and just tell me what you think in general, the loudest, craziest, most moronic people get the most attention, and therefore there's a sort of incentive where most students, as we just saw Jerry Seinfeld give a commencement speech at Duke, 60 students came out of 15,000, if I remember correctly. And those 60 students got, instead of their stories come out of how nice his speech was, the students getting their commencement, working so hard for their degrees, the big story was 60 students walk out, and their whole walkout was maybe 2 seconds. They walked out, they were booed by most of the students. And Jerry Seinfeld continued with his speech. And instead of talking about his speech, everybody was talking about this thing. And therefore, there's sort of an incentive to be as crazy, as hateful, as really vile, and you get all of the attention. And I really don't know what we can do about it. I don't think we both know, but it seems that we have to at least recognize that the crazier you are, the more attention you'll get.
That's true, but two things about that. First of all, I think Seinfeld's speech was more in the news because of it. The actual speech, after the 30 seconds of coverage of the walkout, his speech has gone viral, which it wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. Celebrities give commencement addresses at this time of year, and you don't hear about anyone, but this one got heard about, and it was a good speech in general. And two, if the goal is to publicize crazy hate, that's not necessarily an effective PR strategy. I don't think, seeing these students argue that all Zionists should be killed, and you can't walk here. This is free Palestinian land, and all this. Seeing the average American seeing this says, well, what is going on with our universities, and it kind of lowers their legitimacy altogether. So whatever yes, it does make the news, but if the goal is to kind of convince the American public, I'm not sure how effective that is.
Yeah, I don't think it convinces anyone, and I think it's very counterproductive. And I think a lot of young people, just in general, looking back at myself, college students in America are much younger than college students in Israel because we go to the army for 3 years. And when I'm looking at before I joined the army here at the age of 19, a lot of these college students, the freshmen, I assume, are 18 or so, and I was an idiot. And a lot of these, no, but it's true. You don't know anything. You haven't usually gone out of your parents' home. This is the first time you're out of the house. And the whole media, first of all, the media strategy seems to be just screaming. And secondly, I think for some reason, the general media, the way they portray these people is like, these are such intellectual giants, these students, they know what they're doing. They're protesting, they're bringing out their most important ideas, and it's just very, very weird to me. I don't know. They keep on saying that college students made a lot of changes in the past, different things. Could be, but you see these students, and it's like, I don't think they're making a lot of change.
There's kind of a protest myth or a fetish that you go to college, and part of that experience is you engage in demonstrations and protests. Now, most people do not even during kind of the mythologized heyday in the 60s of the civil rights era in Vietnam. Most people were not engaged in any sort of protest or demonstrations, regardless of the righteousness of the cause or anything like this. Most people kind of keep their heads down, and they don't want to be right-wingers or left-wingers or political at all. They're just there to get their degree and have a good time, right? Some of the heroes that we've seen in the last 6 months are fraternity boys, right? Who are just there to party, and they want to support the flag. And what are these protesters doing? This is ugly. We're just going to sing the national anthem and drown you out, kind of thing, right? It's kind of an interesting dynamic. Perhaps more bothersome is the professors that have gotten involved, and the reaction of the university administrations.
Yes.
And that raises two things, and that's the ideological skew of the teaching and the greater bureaucratization of higher education, and especially in the last decade or so, the rise of these among the non-teaching staff, the administrators, of whom there are now more than faculty, of whether you call it DEI, whether you call it kind of just this illiberal postmodern theory of hierarchies of privilege, dividing everyone through into oppressor and oppressed classes, and Jews are kind of white colonialists, oppressors, and viewing everything through lenses of identity. So truth is relative. Your rights and your freedoms are relative depending on what position in the intersectional privilege hierarchy you occupy. These kinds of noxious theories going back to Marcuse and the Frankfurt School of philosophers and all of them, you can get very, very academic and eggheady about it, but fundamentally it goes against classical liberal ideas of free speech and due process.
Meritocracy, I think
Absolutely. You know, forget right and left. You know, the core mission of any institution of higher education is to seek truth and to develop knowledge and to educate, very neutral kind of ideals. And this goes against that. That is fundamentally why there's a crisis in higher education in America right now.
Ilya, I want to just, for 2 seconds, if you can, just give the experience that you had when you wanted to try to get into being in higher education lately. And
Right.
I'm just going to set up why I'm asking you, because it is exactly relevant to what you just said, meaning the administrative state, and I'm trying to like be nice about it. It's sort of like these people in the background who are looking to catch people who are out of line ideologically and looking to just make people, I think, in a way, scared to talk, scared to teach, scared to be honest. These DI statements that a lot of times they have to do before you go to work at one of these colleges, you have to write how much you're into diversity, how much you're into equity, and it incentivizes people to lie, I think, and it's just very, very weird. So maybe just give us your take about what you went through, because I think it is taking it to the extreme, but it is to show what we're up against.
Sure. Well, for a long time in my career, and you can look up my bio, I've been a constitutional lawyer of various kinds. In that, I've been fortunate to have a career where sometimes I'm a lawyer, sometimes I'm straddling the legal, political, academic, and media worlds. So everything from academic articles to popular books to blog posts, TV hits, debating professors, doing all these various different things. And for a long time, I was at the Cato Institute, as you mentioned, which is America's foremost libertarian think tank. But I got an opportunity to come to Georgetown University and was hired by Randy Barnett, who's kind of the godfather of libertarian legal theory these days, and a very influential professor. And he founded the Center for the Constitution at Georgetown Law School. And he hired me to be the executive director and to be a senior lecturer. 4 days before I was due to start that job back in January of 2022, news of Justice Breyer's retirement broke. And I was doing media commentary. You know, I'm a Supreme Court expert. I wrote my last book, A Supreme Disorder, about the politics of judicial nominations. I was doing a lot of media. And that night, I was looking at Twitter, and this is not a good practice. It's not a best practice. I was kind of getting upset about the commentary and the narrative, because Biden had reinforced his campaign pledge to appoint a Black woman. And I thought, you know, you should appoint whoever you think the best person might be. And I thought, and I tweeted out, if I was a Democratic progressive president, I would pick, and I chose the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, the second most prestigious court in the United States, who happens to be an Indian American immigrant, very well respected scholar, progressive, you know, checks all the boxes, except he's not a Black woman.
Right.
And I said, well, under today's hierarchy of intersectionality, that won't work, and we will end up with a, quote, lesser Black woman, meaning, you know, less, you know, by basic operation of logic. If I chose candidate A, everyone else in the whole world is less qualified, or as I put, you know, lesser, which is poorly phrased. But anyway,
that's set off what you mean. Which is,
and 76% of Americans agreed that Biden should have chosen the best person, looked at all candidates without regard to race and sex and everything else. But anyway, overnight, I tweeted that out, that hot take, and then I went to bed. And I woke up in the morning and everything had exploded, and people were out for my job, and my life flashed before my eyes. Everything that I'd worked for my entire life was crumbling down because of this poorly phrased tweet. Those were 4 days of hell. And ultimately, I've written about this on my Substack, Shapiro's Gavel. It'll be in more detail in my book. But ultimately, the dean decided not to fire me right there, not to absolve me, not to say this is free speech or whatever, but to onboard me. I was started my job officially, but immediately suspended, pending an investigation into whether what I said on social media violated the policies on harassment and anti-discrimination. And there was this sham investigation. I was interviewed by the DEI office and human resources and all of this. Again, over a tweet where the school's policies are all very short and clear. This is a law school. You assign it to the junior professor to figure this out, right? But no, it ended up taking 4 months, and it became clear that this was a sham waiting for the students to get off campus. And then I was technically absolved on the point that I wasn't yet employed by Georgetown when I tweeted, so these policies didn't apply to me in the first place. So I celebrated that technical victory, but then I read the fine print. I got this 10-page report from the DEI office, which at Georgetown is called the Office on Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action. IDEA. And they made clear that not just me, but this was a shot across the bow of all faculty. If I said something that offended somebody, that somebody complained about, that would create a, quote, hostile educational environment, and I'd be back in this Kafkaesque inquisition. And I realized over that weekend that I couldn't fulfill the job I'd been hired to do in that way. And as one does, I wrote a loud resignation letter and published it in the Wall Street Journal, and away we went. And so since then, in those 2+ years, I've been using the platform I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia, driven by, again, this illiberal, toxic ideology.
Can I ask you, just if you're allowed to talk about it, what exactly did the investigators, quote unquote, ask you? There was one tweet. It was very short. What exactly? You're coming in for an interrogation, I guess. I don't know what it's called exactly.
It was surreal. It was a Zoom meeting because this was still during COVID, and Georgetown was very COVID sensitive, so I couldn't even meet the dean in person because we'd have to wear masks. It was crazy. But anyway, I had this 1 hour Zoom with the investigators, and Hannah Arendt had this phrase, the banality of evil. I don't want to oversell this. These were not, Nazis. They didn't want to kill me or anything like that. But it was just these bureaucrats that were asking me, so what were you thinking when you tweeted? Give me some more about the context. What was your intention? And they asked this again and again and again, hoping that I would confess to something or like a struggle session or something. And I'm like, I told you, I've already been in public about this. Like, I'm not going to change my story. I could and should have worded it better, but my intent was to say that Biden shouldn't be limited by race and sex, and that's it. And it's like they couldn't believe it. And so it was all very anticlimactic in a sense. And then they also interviewed students and faculty about the impact of my speech. And it was just a kind of like I said, it's a farce. There's not much to investigate there.
It reminded me about your story, and I do recommend reading the piece that you put in the Wall Street Journal after, because it is very explanatory about the problems. You explained it very well about what you went through, and also about why it's such a bad thing what you went through, not just for you, for society in America at large. But I was reminded in the New York Times, they had an op-ed piece that they published from Tom Cotton during the Black Lives Matter protests, and they basically, the workers at the Times staged walkouts. They said that it personally put them in physical danger, this op-ed piece, and basically they pushed out the editor of the op-ed section after less than a week, and I think it is emblematic of a lot of these Times reporters, with the young ones coming out of the universities. The fact that at universities a lot of times the speech is violence, I think it's sort of now axiomatic that it's sort of taught already that speech is something that we should be scared of, that we should be, and it's very weird also with these protests now that a lot of the speech, they're actually praising terrorism and murder.
Yes.
But
Speech
that's
is
okay.
violence, except when it's anti-Semitic, apparently. And
Exactly.
it's there are a lot of ironies here that there are people defending these genocidal
Yeah.
chants, and this came out in the disastrous testimony of the university presidents in December, that on October 6th you would be investigated and disciplined for using the wrong pronouns, and here we are calling for the eradication of the Jewish state and Zionists off campus and all of these things. And that's you have to put it in context. Now, Americans do have a right to be hypocrites.
Yes.
I'm not calling for punishing speech. I think you should just apply the rules in an even-handed manner and recognize that, as I wrote in an essay that continues being continues to be brought up in these discussions for the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication back in November, there are things that are not speech. So if you are assaulting someone or vandalizing for an expressive purpose, that you don't have First Amendment protection for that. Or the most colorful example of that I heard about was there was someone who urinated on a Hillel and claimed, well, this is expressive. Well, sorry, no, you don't get a defense against a charge of public urination, even if you had a political motive or what have you. And then there are certain types of speech that aren't protected, death threats or incitement of violence, and there's clear Supreme Court jurisprudence on what that is. And then finally, we have time, place, and manner regulations on campus. That means you can't disrupt classes, or if a student organization books a room to have an event, you can't disrupt that. You can't block passageways for people trying to get to class, all of which we've seen in the last number of months. Or in the real world, apart from campus, we care about political speech. That's the core free speech that we want to protect. And yet I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That's disturbing the peace, and that can be regulated. Or blocking streets, for that matter. It doesn't matter what your viewpoint is. You're not, the police aren't arresting you because they agree or disagree with what you're saying, but you can't block streets. So these kind of three buckets are key to understanding the legalities of what's going on.
Yeah, and I would just, before we go on to the next subject, say that a lot of this is, like you said, the hierarchy of the oppressed, and the Jews in this hierarchy are not even relevant because we're successful. And so also financially, I think, and politically, and we're perceived to be elites. And so therefore, even though we are a minority, religious minority, and for example, in Israel, most Jews aren't white, they're Sephardic, but that doesn't matter. And also, we can see it with the Asian community.
Most of these protesters, think of all Jews as pale-faced Polish people or something, and you hear these chants go back to Poland. When I think the average Israeli is much darker than the average one of these protesters. They've never heard of Sephardi, they've never heard of Mizrahi, Ethiopian. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so I think just a lot of it is the fact, like you said, the administration and this hierarchy, which is so illiberal, and maybe even if you took the actual word progressive, it's so unprogressive, but that's where we are today. Let me turn to what's happening here in Israel. Maybe we could learn something from what America. We've had up to October 7, the year before, basically, since January, so 10 months, these giant protests in Israel. And I do understand a lot of it. I wrote about it, that a lot of the protests weren't specifically, the trigger was the judicial reform bill that the government brought in, but I think it was more general. People felt and still feel that the country is changing in a way that they don't like demographically, in terms of the religious policies, the conscription to the army, etc. But there was the specific issue of the judicial reform, which I wanted to ask you about as someone who does understand constitutional law in America. Were you following what was happening in Israel about the judicial reform? And if so, what were your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I was. I'm not an expert on Israeli law and politics, but I was a very interested observer, and I have friends who work for Kohelet, the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, so who would brief me from time to time on what was going on. The judicial reform it was a lot of different things. And of course, Israelis debate whether Netanyahu made a mistake to go for everything at the same
Yeah.
time, or would it be would he have needed to use the same amount of political capital to have each individual thing? So why not just try the whole thing at the same time? Anyway, that's a separate discussion. But
Right.
it does seem to me, in broad strokes, that there's something wrong with this with the Supreme Court enforcing an unwritten constitution based on their own values, based on their own judgment of what good policy or good philosophy might be. There's a problem with that, probably a need for reform. This idea of the reasonableness test and how that's been updated. There's also, I think, a problem with judicial selection, where effectively the Supreme Court chooses or has a veto over its own successors. That's
Yes.
not the best way to choose. I think that's non-democratic. This is part of Bibi's purpose was to make the Supreme Court more democratic. Ironically, given that a lot of the protests were saying this is Netanyahu is against democracy and things like this. There are other details which I'm less familiar with, which perhaps are less clear or more complicated. The arguments for and against, but I think. For a long time, there's been a realization on the right, on the Israeli right, certainly, that there's something wrong here, and we have a juristocracy, a government by the Supreme Court that fires ministers, and you have this standalone attorney general, which is very different in Israel than it is in the American conception. Again, I'm not steeped in the Israeli legal tradition, but I think there definitely was a need for reform. Remarkable to think that how divided Israeli society was over this for the course of a year
Right.
until October 7th. And I hope that when there's some sort of normalization of Israeli politics, when Hamas is hopefully wiped out, and then whatever happens in the north, which is the more serious threat, that when this topic is taken up again, that I do think that some changes are merited.
Do you think that, just as a general thing, one of the things that was people who were trying to get to some kind of a resolution from both sides were kept on saying, a lot of them were saying, we should have a referendum. We should put to the public parts of the bill and let the public decide. And both the government and a lot of the protesters organizations were both against it. So the government was scared, I guess, that they would lose the vote, and the protesters were probably also scared, but their reason was that the judiciary should not be applied to on the whims of a majority of the people.
Well, this is effectively constitutional reform. This is not electing judges. So I think there is a lot of merit that certainly in terms of legitimacy, you want such foundational changes to be adopted by the citizenry. And I think there's a big problem in Israel. The basic problem with all of these institutional debates is that Ben Gurion, the founding generation, promised that there would be a constitution written at some point, and that never got done. And
Yeah.
of course, it's very hard to do once you have a mature society and an established state. It's hard at that point to say, okay, now we're going to write the constitution. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. Although I do think that's reforms that are so fundamental probably do need some sort of democratic legitimacy to ultimately be accepted.
Yeah, I would just say that I would be horrified if we would actually here try to get a constitution, because I would just put it to you: would you want the American electorate as it is today to form a new if you had to form a new constitution? I assume the answer would be no, because we know just the way politics is and who they elect. At least here, we don't. I just I'm looking at the latest government, the coalition, and like, for example, the Constitution would probably have some kind of exemption for ultra-Orthodox in the army. It would have different exemptions and stuff for settlers. And not that I'm against the settlements personally, but I think that at this point where we are as a country, the Constitution that would be, if we would have a Constitution, would be very, very sectoral, would benefit sectors instead of the entire electorate. So I think that's a very big problem, how you can do it at this point in a society.
I mean, generally you need super majorities to approve. Just a bare,
Here
you
you
know,
don't.
50. No, I
Here,
understand, but for constitutional legitimacy,
yeah,
you know, it can't be just, you know, a majority today and then 10 years from now you have a different majority that changes things. There has to be some sort of
yes.
deeper acceptance for there to be a legitimacy of the founding documents.
I want to ask you about something in America that I think does interest a lot of Israelis, and that is the changes now to Title IX in the also, and maybe tell me if this has something to do with Title IX, the courts for sexual assault and in the universities. So, if I remember correctly, during the Obama administration, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, if a student was accused by another student of either sexual harassment or something to that effect, the universities itself basically police what happens on campus, and there was different exemptions for these types of acts, meaning that, if I remember correctly, the accuser did not have to confront the accused. The accuser did not have to the accused did not have to confront the accuser. And then when Trump came in, they changed that. And so now they changed it back. Could you just give us a little bit of that and how it's even constitutional? And it seems like a court of law where you can't confront someone who's accusing you.
Yes. So Title IX this is Title IX of the Education Act, or the Education Act amendments, was passed in 1972, so just over 50 years ago. And the actual law is 37 words. It's not this complicated legislative structure. All it says is that you can't be denied for in institutions that receive federal education funds. You can't be denied equal education access to educational opportunities based on sex. That's it. That's it. And so thousands of pages of regulations have come out of those 37 words. And you're right, there's been this swing back and forth. Well, in general, you know, since Congress increasingly can't pass substantive legislation, all you know, major legal changes happen in the administrative state, in the executive agencies. In this case, the Education Department. And you're right. Under the Obama years, there were cutbacks on due process protections for those accused of sexual harassment or assault. Trump changed that back and put in more protections. Now Biden swung back the other way. In the American press, most of the emphasis or most of the attention has been to the addition of protections for gender identity and
Yeah.
sexual orientation, the redefinition of what based on sex means. And that's important for in terms of you know, biological men, you know,
In sports, I
showering
think.
with girls. Sports, not necessarily. They punted that because they knew
Ah.
that was the least popular. And so in the second Biden term, if that happens, I think they're going to do that with sports. But they were completely silent about sports, which remains a state and local issue. But in terms of bathrooms and locker rooms and other things like that, that's where that's gotten a lot of attention.
Wait, so could you just explain that to us? Just so if I'm a if I'm a female male to female transitioner, and so from that moment on, no one could tell me basically not to go into the female bathroom or shower, etc. Right? That is the actual regulation right now.
Yes. Well, there's going to be litigation about this because gender identity is not defined. So there's 1,800 pages of regulations, and gender identity is not defined. But based on how this has come out in other contexts, yeah, if a biological male tells his teacher or principal, you know, I'm transitioning, at that point, they has to be let into the girls' bathroom or the
But
facility that
isn't that a little bit weird? Because, well, you'll probably agree with me, I guess, but it just seems a little bit counterintuitive that the whole point of Title IX was to protect women, and now you're basically, like you said, the women
yes,
cannot object.
but you understand American elites are divided on being able to define what a woman is. I mean, this came up in the last Supreme Court
Yeah,
confirmation.
about the
So
same
yeah,
Supreme
that's
Court justice you
this is
talked
the thing.
about.
Title IX allows for sex segregated facilities. So, you know, these new regulations don't change that. They don't say, you know, we're abolishing separate locker rooms because that's bigoted or something. Separate is unequal or something. No, you're still allowed to have separate facilities and all that, but this is who gets into those facilities, and so
Exactly.
this is the redefinition of what sex is. But anyway, that's gotten most of the attention in the American press. But perhaps more significantly, from a legal perspective, is the impact on due process and free speech,
Yeah.
because most cases, there's a lot of high-profile cases with the culture wars about the trans community and things like this in locker rooms and bathrooms. But most cases that are relevant to Title IX, whether that make it into courts, whether that are investigated by universities, involve accusations of sexual assault, sexual harassment. And here, nothing to do with gender identity, nothing to do with sexual orientation. And here is where a lot of protections were removed. Yes, you don't get to confront your accuser. You don't have a right to a lawyer. Sometimes you don't have a right to even see all of the evidence against you. The person who fields the complaint and investigates it also adjudicates it and acts as your executes the punishment as well. So it's kind of the prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner is all one person who can be a DEI officer or the Title IX officer. That's the huge due process problems. And then from a free speech perspective, if you use the wrong pronouns or otherwise make someone feel bad and feel that they are not getting the same educational opportunities because of their gender identity, which means sex now, the university starts investigating students and faculty for these speech violations that become become the equivalent of harassment. And then we're back into that inquisition. So the culture war issues about bathrooms and locker rooms get all the attention, but I think most of the regulations and most of the regulatory changes are in the due process and speech areas.
Why? Let me just. It's a little bit shocking when you think about it. It's like, first of all, I assume, why isn't it actually being adjudicated in a court of law? Meaning, if someone is being accused of sexual assault or sexual harassment or, God forbid, rape, there have been cases. Why isn't it a lot of times? Why does the university get to pick who's the judge, get to pick what evidence you get to see, get to pick if you're allowed to have a lawyer or not? Why is it even done by the universities?
Right. Well, for cases of criminal violations, police are involved, people get prosecuted, things like that. The university, obviously the university is not going to put someone in jail. They're not going
Right.
to, have a criminal trial or anything like that. They don't have that authority, but they enforce university rules for against a hostile educational environment, to prevent harassment, to prevent discrimination in various ways. And so things that are actual crimes get swept up in this. But you're right. I think when we have actual criminal violations, at that point the university should hand it over to the police. But what they're focused on is things like bullying and harassment and violation of the rules, stalking and things like this, which again can lead to criminal prosecution eventually.
But there were, like, for example, as you said, pronouns. People get thrown out of universities now. There have been cases where people, for different weird things like pronouns, or even like things even more serious, where it then turned out that the accuser made the story up or exaggerated different aspects of the story. I saw a professor that I forgot where exactly he basically takes these stories and puts them up when they're proven to be false. And who gives back students' reputations after stuff like that? It seems very,
Right.
very.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge problem. There are lawsuits over this, and increasingly students and faculty win these lawsuits against universities, or they get big settlements or
Yeah.
something like that. And already there are lawsuits against these new Title IX regulations, for that matter, as written. Forget how they're going to be applied, because you're right. Expelling someone or having them lose their job, that's a real. That's you can have a tort claim or a
Yeah.
breach of contract. Under the law, those are real economic, reputational harms that the legal system, the civil justice system, exists to remedy. And so schools are have been. It's expensive, of course, and it takes a long time to sue. And even if 5 years later you end up prevailing and get paid some amount of money, you're still in the Google search. You're labeled as this harasser or what
Exactly.
have you. You're right. So it's a huge problem, but only when the courts start pushing back on this, and universities get the message that they can't do it. But it's this is part of what contributes to
Yeah.
our litigation friendly society.
That's putting an understatement in America. I want to ask you about maybe also as an American who supports Israel, and you've been here since October 7th. And when October 7th happened, I remember, first of all, I was in shock. I lost friends. I lost a number of friends in the war itself, as in the reserves since then. And in the beginning, the world was with us, especially America. I remember President Biden came here like right after. I remember the exact how many days, but he was here. He gave us his utmost support, at least in words and even after in deeds. And he said to our enemies, don't. I think he also meant to us, don't, but that's a separate issue. But in general, the feeling was that we have friends and that America's with us. And then it seems to me that during the last few months, the Biden administration, looking at these crazy protests and thinking places like Michigan and other places, they're basically changing. First of all, the first thing we saw was the rhetoric itself. So Israel is, first of all, they totally took the Hamas casualty numbers, which we know from 2 days ago, the UN itself lowered by half the amount of women and children that they say were killed. So they took false numbers that we know now are 100% false, because the UN is not pro-Israel, to put it lightly. And they also were both sidesing. Like when Biden was asked, what do you think about these anti-Semitic protests? He said, I also condemn those who don't understand the Palestinians. So I guess my question is, we said that they're a very small minority. Why is the American administration, President of the United States, thinks that he has to cater to this small minority of people in order to win the election? Why can't he take the mainstream in all the polls, like we said, position, even of Democrats, and say these people, like Bill Clinton had the sister soldier moment in the 90s, where he said, I don't want these people's votes. If you're racist, if you're anti-Semitic, etc. He seems to not be able to do that. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have good news and I have bad news for you on this question. First of all, Biden is not in the latest polls losing Michigan because of Gaza.
Exactly.
There are deeper structural issues with this election, with Biden's candidacy, and as you said, even in Michigan, people are pro-Israel, and the virulently pro-Hamas side in Dearborn is not that huge. I mean, he's losing lots of states where this is not the same dynamic,
Exactly.
which tells me that this very rapid turn against Israel and the holding back the munitions and all that is not an election getting a political decision in terms of rank politics to win the presidential election. So the good news is the American people still recognize it, and they don't I think agree with Biden's policy of the last few weeks, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, his harsh words for Israel.
Yeah.
That does not represent America. That's not popular.
So why is he doing it?
Yes, that's where the bad news is. And that is that within the Democratic Party, and especially with elites and the administration, especially the younger crowd, kind of a similar dynamic to what you talked about with the New York Times and Tom Cotton in a different context, there's a lot more anti-Israel sentiment in the perhaps most worryingly on the National Security Council, where people go when they're interested in the Middle East, and when they're interested in the Middle East, they take a more pro-Palestinian position, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and all that. And so Biden being a weak president because he's old and he's lost a few steps, and he wasn't that good on foreign policy to begin with, as former former Defense Secretary Bob Gates said Biden's been wrong on every major foreign policy issue in the last half century. So you have, a weak figurehead on top, and so that allows more of the lower level political appointees to be powerful, and that is where a lot of anti-Israel sentiment is unfortunately concentrated. And so it's an administration-wide problem, especially in the State Department, especially in the National Security Council.
So what you're saying is that in a way, even though it's not one of the top issues for voters, when you look at
Even among young people, even among that 18 to 23 or 25 cohort, you give them, 10 issues, and Gaza, Israel will be like the last,
Yeah. So he's basically, even though it's not important, it is important to his, I guess, people around him, the administrative state, the top people there. And so he's basically willing to, I don't want to use words, but stab Israel in the back effectively, saying that he won't give us weapons that we need and stuff like that, because people around him are pressuring him into doing this, even though he promised not to do it. And there's videos from him in 2019 saying, no, we can't do that. That would be crazy. That would be a huge mistake, he said. And so you're saying that it's not a political thing. It's more a structural thing of his party.
Yes, in a word.
Yeah. I have two more questions that I want to pick your brain about. One of the things that I think in Israel, a lot of people are very interested is the Trump trials. I didn't think of asking, but you were mentioning the judicial reform bill, and I was like, I want to ask him about the Trump trials. Why? Because there's the Netanyahu trial, and a lot of the Netanyahu supporters using this as a parallel, meaning just like they don't like Trump, and so they're using lawfare to attack him and to stop him from gaining politically. They're using the same thing for Trump, the elites, the people in power. Do you see? I'm not even going to talk about Netanyahu because I assume you're not an expert in what's happening.
I don't know the details of the charges against him.
But I will ask you about Trump's trials. So he's in this court. We know now all the other trials, if I'm not mistaken, have been delayed somehow or another. He's very, very good at this. Well, he's not good. He didn't make the prosecutor sleep with the assistant prosecutor. But other than that, it has worked out for him. The only trial that's happening now is the one in New York with the porn star and the lawyer that was
which is the weakest of all of the charges against him and the most heavily politicized.
So my question is, first of all, it seems to me that I don't even understand, and I think most people, even lawyers, don't understand what the actual underlying crime is that they're charging him. So what did he do that's wrong according to the prosecution?
This hasn't even come out in the actual trial. So here is the strongest version of what he did and why he's on trial. This same prosecutor, by the way, the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, initially said that he wasn't going to charge Trump with this, but then he decided last year, I guess because he wants higher office in New York and to benefit himself. I don't know. This doesn't. By the way, this trial does not benefit Biden and the Democrats nationally. It might benefit Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA himself, but who knows? So he changed. He went against previous, again, Democratic Party prosecutors. His own view changed that ultimately, and the charge is that Trump used business money from his Trump organizations to pay off a porn star that he slept with to keep quiet in order to influence or prevent damaging information from getting out in the 2016 election. So it's a falsification of business records to violate campaign finance law.
Isn't that
it's a head scratcher? It's a head scratcher.
But that's the whole point of paying someone not to talk.
Yes, but it could be his general reputational harm. It could be, it's not even clear whether he was using business assets. This is why Michael Cohen, his former fixer, was testifying because, it turns out that Cohen was using his own money with a mortgage back, the home equity loan to hide it from his wife, but then he was being reimbursed by Trump somehow. It's this whole convoluted scheme. And again, this, it's 2024. This allegedly happened in 2016. So past the normal statute of limitations for these things, which is why it has to be a felony, which is a higher standard of proof, a higher level of fraud, all of these things. Again, the prosecutors in New York could have charged this in 2017, 18, they didn't.
Right.
And so there's all of this sort of thing, and it's unclear, for all of the things that Trump is doing to hurt himself, violating the gag rule, he gets fined and found in contempt of court by the judge. All of these things, he's not his best helper in the falling asleep during the trial. All these different things that are going on. It's a three-ring circus. Honestly, it's not like anybody is looking good here. But paying off a porn star to help your reputation is not a crime, and you have to. Anyway, they have to establish all of these things, and it looks weak. The American people are like, "What? This is what you're ultimately charging him with?" The other charges, the other prosecutions, as I alluded to, are more serious. Mishandling classified documents. But then Biden wasn't charged for doing the same thing, or trying to subvert the 2020 election. A little more complicated, both in the federal level and in Georgia. But again, this thing happening in New York, everyone, as soon as he was charged in March of last year, that's when Trump began his rise in the Republican primaries. Before that point, it looked like DeSantis would be the nominee. Other people were competitive. But once Trump was charged for this thing that the Republican primary voters especially saw as a farce, at that point there was this effect, this dynamic of rallying around Trump because everyone is persecuting him for political reasons.
Right. And also, I think, like I said, he has like the best luck. Like the Georgia case was like a RICO case. I think I'm not a lawyer, but
a conspiracy to undermine election processes. Yes.
It seemed to me that it's easier to convict on RICO because you could turn some of the people against him. And I'm not an expert again, but he has like the best luck. Suddenly she's sleeping with the lawyer and the whole thing is like a circus, and it has nothing even to do with him at that point. Now she's the focus. Nobody's talking about Trump itself. Everybody's talking about Fannie Willis sleeping with this guy.
And now there's an appeal of the lower court ruling about whether she can stay on the case. So everything gets delayed. So there are not going to be any trials at this point other than this New York one before the election.
So does it mean also that he is in a position, and then I'll ask you about just your trip to Israel, because I find that interesting too. But does that mean that if Trump loses the election, he's going to jail? Like, in a sense, this is a make or break. If he wins, he's able to basically, I guess, appoint the attorney general to try to like push these things out of the way. And if he loses, he's probably going to jail. So for him, if I'm understanding correctly, this is like a death or life situation here.
It could be, and just to be clear, the president doesn't have authority over state officials or judges. There would be further litigation, probably going up to the Supreme Court if he's convicted in New York and Georgia. What does a punishment of a sitting president by a state look like? Is there immunities applied? Are there delays? All of these novel legal issues in what's become known as Trump law, right? There's a pending case before the Supreme Court now about presidential immunity and official acts, and what is that? All of these things. So that's possible. But if he loses, maybe these prosecutors would start being less interested in sending him to jail. At that point, he's gone.
They did their job.
They did their right. Well, but who knows? If he loses, is he still the front runner for the 2028 nomination at that point? Stay tuned. It's ratings gold, Jerry, gold.
Yeah, it's very weird that 330 million people more. This is the two best that America could give us. My last question to you is: you were here not too long ago in Israel, and I saw a little bit of your tweets about it, and I'll just ask, number one, what does it mean for someone who grew up in America, who has a connection, as you're a Jewish, but you have a connection to here, but you're not Israeli, obviously, and you this thing happens. What, first of all, made you want to come? There's a war going on. People are shooting missiles. Iran's attacking us. This morning, as we speak, there was homes in the north that were just destroyed by anti-tank missiles that are flying over the border, and you decide to come. So number one, why did you come? And number two, when you were here, what was it like being here? What was it like going to these places that were totally destroyed?
So I actually grew up in Canada. I was born in Russia, and we immigrated when I was 4 to Canada. I grew up in and around Toronto, and then came to the U.S. for college and law school, and have been in the D.C. area now professionally for it'll be 20 years soon. Um, but I tell you, I grew up in a typical Soviet emigre story. We were completely secular. I think the last people in my family who practiced Judaism were my great grandparents, something like that. Um, the first time I went to a Shabbat service was when I was in Jackson, Mississippi, clerking, and had nothing to do on a Friday night. So, not religious.
Yeah.
But I've been to Israel 3 times, once on a family trip and twice through a federation missions. But the last time was 2007. So it's a completely different country, even without October 7th. And I had the opportunity to come. I was invited to be part of and help put together a media influencers trip. So I was basically the least influential person on this trip. Dave Rubin was on the trip. Guy Benson was on the trip. Carol Markowitz, Mary Catherine Ham. So they've all done reporting and things like this. I wrote up some thoughts and my reactions on my Substack, Shapiro's Gavel, and I've done a bunch of media interviews that touched upon it, but I haven't written up kind of a definitive article. At this point, it just kind of informs my understanding as we're talking now. And I wanted to go because I wanted to understand Israel's reality. I wanted to show support. On October 7th, I woke up and I started looking at social media, and it was unbelievable. Quite literally, I'm like, what is going on? And that weekend, I felt more Jewish than I ever had. And my dad, who passed away last year, had given me a Magen David that I never wore. I'm like, Dad, I don't wear necklaces. What is this? But I started wearing it, and I've been wearing it ever since. Under my shirt here. And it again, not necessarily religious, but just a connection to the people, the country, the Jewish project, as it were. And so I felt that emotionally, and we started lighting Shabbat candles, and I started talking more to my kids. My oldest is 8. We have 8, 6, and some toddler twins. And when I got the opportunity to come on this trip, I jumped at it. Just to understand better what was going on. I'd been to Iraq, by the way. This probably not the most dangerous place I've been to, but in 2007 I was in Iraq for a few months as a rule of law advisor. And I got to see on this trip, which was put together by the Maccabee Task Force run by David Brogg. They're doing great work to try to bring people, to influencers, to write about what's going on in Israel. And we went everywhere. We went to the massacre sites in the south. We went to the border areas that, as you said, were just bombed even this morning. In the north, we had to wear helmets and flak jackets, and we were under military instruction about when we could go there, where we could go, and all of that. We went to Jerusalem. We went to briefings at the defense ministry, lots of different things, and it was exhilarating, depressing, inspiring. Just very overwhelming. I'm still processing it. Everything, the hostage square, and just seeing lots of talking to different people in different walks of life, and you could really tell how small a country it was, because we were based at a hotel in Tel Aviv, and we always came back to the hotel in the evening. We went to the farthest extremes of the country, and we were always back at our hotel in Tel Aviv. It's a country the size of Delaware, smaller than New Jersey. Just remarkable.
Do you think that a lot of American Jews feel the way you just explained, that what happened, and I think also the anti-Semitism and all these big protests that we spoke about before made them feel, I guess, more empathetic to their Jewishness?
Absolutely. I think there's been a fundamental transformation of American Jewry, trying to understand the new dynamic, both politically, but both emotionally, as I described, their relationship to their own Judaism or their own Jewishness, and politically about where they stand in their generally liberal democratic coalition. Although, interestingly, younger Jews tend to be more conservative, vote more Republican than older Jews, which is an
maybe
inversion.
because they're more religious, because the Orthodox
that's part of it, but not necessarily. And I should add, the biggest gender gap in any demographic, the way that pollsters look at it, is among young Jews. So young males under 35 or 30, regardless of how you slice it, versus females of that cohort have the biggest gap in terms of
The males
Republican
are voting
voting.
for Trump and the females are voting for Biden in the polls?
Yes,
Among Jews.
the gap. Well, not just Trump, Biden, but who they vote for Congress and all of those things.
So you could
I
say
think
that the men are more supportive of Israel, and or more that what happened in Israel is making them change the way they're voting.
Well, we haven't really had an election. Last year was an off year.
Right.
So we'll see what happens at the next election. And there's what would the gender gap be if it was someone other than Trump at the
Right.
top of the ticket, a quote unquote normal Republican or something like that. But anyway, there's an interesting dynamic in terms of political opinions among American Jewry. And yeah, the religious are that's one other aspect. But a lot of there's a crisis in Reform Jewry.
Yes.
A lot of Reform rabbis have spoken about this. We totally misunderstood what was going on. Yes, I think there's a day by day change in mainstream institutions are changing. Chabad is much more popular now. Lots of things going on in the American Jewish community that I do think, for once, what I just expressed to you is fairly representative.
Wow. So I guess we'll see in the coming election if it'll actually pan out, because a lot of times people say in polls, but then when they come to actually pull the lever, they go back to their old habits. But it could be that
I think there's going to be a lot of Jews who vote Democrat, except for president, they leave it blank.
Aha.
I think that's going to happen.
So sort of like when the Biden was worried about the uncommitted, he might get a lot of uncommitted in the actual election from Jews. Also in swing states like Pennsylvania, there's a big, large Jewish community. Even in Michigan, I think the Jewish community is pretty big. So it might have an impact. But I think, like you said, we won't know until we actually see the results. Ilya Shapiro, it was a pleasure and very interesting. And I think that your perspective, the last part of your talk was the most interesting because because I do think that Israeli Jews don't really know American Jews. There isn't a lot of crosstalk between us, and we're the two most, most of the Jews worldwide, almost all of them live either in the U.S. or here, and it's almost like you come here, but you're academic and you came with journalists, but the regular person on the street, an American Jew, and the regular Israeli Jew don't really talk to each other, the quote unquote man on the street. And I think it is important to relay what you're relaying to us, to Israelis in Israel, and maybe what I'm relaying to you. It's an interesting dynamic that we don't really get to do a lot. So I thank you so much for being with us. It was a pleasure.
Sure, and I write more of these kind of personal reflections on my Substack, Shapiro's Gabble. And otherwise, you can find me. I'm on Twitter at iShapiro, or X, I guess it's called now, and the Manhattan Institute website. My page there has all of my latest writings.
So everyone go there and subscribe to Ilya Substack. And I just have to say that in 10 years, you haven't aged a bit. So, so thank you so much, Ilya. It was a pleasure.